Hello again. On se retrouve pour une autre session de la table ronde régionale Amérique du Nord de l'UNEP-FI, modérée par Layali Ramahi, North America Network Coordinator for UNEP-FI. In a few, another one of the sessions held as part as UNEP-FI Regional Roundtable North America will take place. Je vous souhaite un beau panel.
Good afternoon and welcome to the third day of the Sustainable Finance Summit and to this UNEP-FI panel on the Just Transition and Decent Work agenda. As introduced, I am Layali Ramahi, with you, the North American Network Coordinator for UNEP-FI, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. The panels across the summit have only brought forward insightful views from leaders and practitioners from a wide spectrum of stakeholders in the transition to a low-carbon economy, and today will be no exception. The transition is contained in the Paris Agreement as a way, primarily, of ensuring that the interests of workers are upheld in the shift to a resilient net zero economy. At the heart of the just transition is the recognition that success will be contingent on designing a transition that is just, not only for workers, but across the socioeconomic spectrum. In our discussion, we will look at the dimensions of a just transition framework from the eyes of different stakeholders, including policy, social fabric, indigenous peoples, and the social and financial sector. How to enable a transition that can build a stronger and inclusive and equitable future with decent work that is sustainable and addressing systemic and risk and injustices. Now, join me in welcoming our guests today. We will be joined by Susan Mikichi, Head, BMO Financial Institute, Mark Podlasly, Director, Economic Policy at First Nations Major Project Coalition, Camilla Roman, Policy Specialist at the International Labour Organization, and Mijin Cha, Assistant Professor at Occidental College, Urban Environmental Policy Department, and a Fellow at Cornell University's Worker Institute. Now, starting off with you, Camilla, and looking holistically at the road ahead. How do you see a just transition furthering the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals? Not only looking at SDG 7 or 13, but looking closely at SDG 8, which is on decent work and economic growth, and SDG 10, reducing inequalities within and among countries.
Thank you very much, Layali, for that question, which is really fundamental to a just transition, because just transition in many ways is like a connective tissue across SDGs. So on the one hand, decent work is at the heart of a just transition, and therefore the connection to SDG 8 is very clear. And the just transition is about equity and social justice, and therefore we do see a clear contribution to eradicating inequalities. But fundamentally, it's also important to bear in mind that a just transition is really an essential enabler of climate ambition, because we can only secure the kind of climate action that are needed to meet the Paris Agreement goal and to maintain a safe climate if we get on board enough stakeholders, if we have the kind of broad-based support that is enabled by addressing the social dimensions of the transition to zero carbon resilient economy. So a just transition is really fundamentally connecting a number of and enabling a number of SDGs. If I can, perhaps, yes, go ahead.
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, I was gonna just say that while on the one hand we look at the opportunities that the just transition tries to foster, and we clearly see that it's about optimizing employment creation, it's about optimizing decent work. There are reasons for looking up. There are reasons to be very hopeful, because we expect net gains of around 24 million by 2030, if just with measures on energy alone. But at the same time, there are a number of policy measures that are required to ensure that the transition is just. So the transition is just really not by default, but it has to be made just by design. And there we can perhaps talk a little bit more about what it takes to get there in terms of optimizing investments into employment-intensive green sectors, and we're talking both about public and private investments, but we're also talking about the need to ensure that the jobs that are created are decent jobs, and therefore to uphold labor rights through safeguards and due diligence. And finally, while I think we do have a lot of reasons for optimism, we do need to be aware that there are very deep restructures of economies and labor markets. And there can be mismatches in terms of the locations where the new jobs are created and the jobs are lost. And there is a temporal gap between the time when the jobs are lost and the times when the jobs are gained. And there have to be measures to ensure that those disruptions are managed, and we don't have live workers and communities stranded. And we need to think about the reskilling of workers that are negatively impacted to help them transition into new jobs. We need to be thinking about social protection, early retirement schemes, incentives for relocation when workers might wish to do so, and redeployment of workers in new occupations, and really an effort to also have some place-based investments in those localities where we see a contractions of fossil fuel-based industries.
Well, that is very interesting to start us off, Camilla, and I like that you started us off with you are very feeling hopeful and positive. And with that place-based comment that where the just transition is a place-based issue, I would like to direct my second question to you, Mijin. If we said at the heart of the transition, not just only to creating decent jobs and employment, but looking at it from a broad, fair, not just for workers, but across socioeconomic spectrum. How can we unpack that just transition that looks holistically at social justice issues and addressing social issues in that transition and moving forward with policy?
Well, thank you for that question and for having me here today. I'm excited for this conversation. I think, that's a really great question, and we could think about it in terms of when we think about just transition, I think the first question that comes to mind is what are we transitioning into? And I think, it's a question of whether you think the climate crisis is caused by just the emission of greenhouse gases, or whether the climate crisis is a natural manifestation of systems of extraction and exploitation. And until we actually address those root causes of extraction and exploitation, we actually will not address the root causes of the climate crisis. And in there, I think, is the need for social justice and social equity be at the center of climate action and for just transition. So we could think of it, more broadly as just transition is a transition to justice, and we need to make our societies more just in order to not only accommodate a low carbon energy transition, but to actually stop the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So when we think about what needs to be done, for instance, it's not just about, the workers that will be displaced and the communities that engage in fossil fuel activities, but what about the communities that have been historically excluded from fossil fuel activity of the economic activity, but have really borne the brunt of the environmental burden, right? So when we think about communities that are impacted by a low carbon transition, it's not just fossil fuel regions, it is really, thinking about who has been the victim of this extractive economy and these extractive industries. And as we transition to a more just society, we have to think about things that I think a lot of climate activists don't really see as climate policies. But in the US, for instance, we have this really terrible healthcare system. So we have to think about, what health inequities are arising from the climate crisis and how do we address those health inequalities as part of climate action and as part of just transition. As we make our societies more just, we need to focus on things that are not necessarily just carbon reductions, but that are a consequence of the same systems that cause carbon emissions. So when we think about, for instance, coal extraction, it happens a lot in a lot of rural communities. It's not just about, as the previous speaker said, it's about place-based investment. So how do we transition these communities away from these extractive industries, which looks at things like, for instance, the US broadband expansion, or things that are just, basic economic development measures that are not necessarily seen in the same sphere as, energy transition. But these are all part of what the conditions that we need to then advance an energy transition.
Well, that is a very interesting uptake on it. And you mentioned that the justice broadly from across economic sectors and communities that were excluded previously. So just before we move on to take Mark's intake on that, what do you think in terms of justice when it comes to place-based and in terms of communities and access to housing and affordable healthcare, as you mentioned, as one of the priorities?
Absolutely. You know, if we think about how we make policy and how we think about policy solutions, if we center the most vulnerable members of our societies, we actually create the best policies, right? When you take care of those that are most vulnerable, the policies that result are better and are more appropriate and more just for the whole society. So for instance, thinking about things like housing, these are all things that will be impacted by the climate crisis, and the unequal access to housing, you know, these are all creations, you know, these are all systems that are created. There's no reason why people should be unhoused, right? Especially in a country like the US, which is allegedly the richest nation in the world. These are all choices that we have made. So as we think about a transition to justice, we need to make different choices, and we need to center those that are most vulnerable in ensuring that we have an actual transition to justice.
Well, an actual transition requires that full stakeholder engagement. And with that, I might transition that discussion to you, Mark. Until recently, broadly speaking, the social dimension of the climate action in terms of green jobs and in terms of the transition has not, or stranded workers in communities has not been at the center of the debate. How can we look at the just transition broadly as a framework? And as Mijin mentioned, to broadly look at stakeholders that are involved. And here, look at equity, look at the Indigenous and First Nation communities and their engagement as workers and as equity owners into the transition and moving forward. I think, Mark, you're on
thank you.
mute.
Got it.
There you go.
So, thank you. As I mentioned, I'm a member of an Indigenous community here in Canada on the US-Canadian border, and I'm leading a group right now called the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, which looks exactly at this issue. The previous speaker made some great comments about the whole question of place-based investment. In the past, we as Indigenous people have been an afterthought or not a thought at all in the building of the infrastructure of North America. The energy systems, the hydroelectric dams, the mining, extraction industry has all happened in our territories and been exported to the urban centers of the country. As we're looking now at this new shift to this new just economy or new green economy, Indigenous people are very concerned that the transition will happen without us again. You're starting to see the new developments that are being proposed, wind farms, solar farms, carbon sequestration, new hydroelectric facilities, transmission lines. Those are going to be hosted in our territories. And was pointed out by both speakers earlier, a lot of the impacts of that are not just environmental, they're social. They're workers' camps showing up in our communities that are starting to use our stretched healthcare facilities. One thing that never comes up in the discussion, at least with our communities, is the gender imbalance. These work camps for pipelines, natural gas pipelines, which are seen as a transition fuel, are 99.9% male, all of a sudden dropped in a community which is not prepared for the social impact that's happening. And you look at the investments that are starting to happen as well. Indigenous people want to be part of the wealth and the green economy that's being generated directly out of our territories. In Canada, Canada has nationally adopted the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which has 46 clauses that outline Indigenous rights, and many of them are going to be running up directly against the plans for a green economy. We want to be sure that those rights are included in the planning, and that goes from the environmental, the social, the economic. It is, as was pointed out, that these transitions, if it's not planned properly, will run roughshod over the most vulnerable minorities in the country. And given that things coming up next, for example, a green transition requires new metals. Just to meet existing car battery demand, EV electric batteries, there's going to be a 14 times increase in nickel, a 9 times increase in copper, similar in iron ore, lithium, cobalt. Where's that going to come from? It's going to come from our territories. So a just transition means that we must be at the table and we must have some input into the system.
Well, that's a very good point that you alluded to, Mark. And of course, just before taking that discussion and broadly, I would like to hear your points on including the I in the ESG. But just to ask, you mentioned UNDRIP as it's known, and now we have the Bill C-15. So do you think that covers the engagement in terms of a just transition, or do we need to tie the knots there to include the Indigenous and First Nations into the discussion?
So just to give some background on where this ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards, the coalition ran a conference on this in March. 1,500 people came, evenly divided between investors and Indigenous people. It was astounding, the interest. ESG standards, in theory, include the communities. They include the interests and values. But when we did our study of that, we found that almost none of the global standards for ESG have any Indigenous involvement. They have no reference to Indigenous values at all. So in our communities, we'd often have investors show up saying, oh, don't worry, this project we're doing, we're ESG compliant. It's like, well, but compliant to what? They're not including Indigenous people. So that's where including the I in ESG comes into place. The question on UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. Yes, it is now implemented in Canada. That's Bill C-15, which you referenced, but it is only just being implemented. It is going to take a generation to harmonize existing laws with the declaration, and that at times will be difficult because there's not a united front on what the clauses mean. From an Indigenous perspective, for example, free, prior, informed consent. What is that? How does that get implemented into developmental procedures? It is the core to moving towards a just society, that all your citizens are included in the decision and all their interests are incorporated into a plan. So there's a lot there to talk about. I will end right now, but we can talk further about that.
Well, absolutely. There's more always to unpack, and with that, with talking about ESG and talking about the time that we do not have to waste, I'm going to turn that to Susan and hear your thoughts from a broader financial sector's perspective. It is important to look at the just transition, as Mark said, and including the First Nations and Indigenous people in the S dialogue. So how can we move forward without using the just transition as an excuse to delay action, to have a more inclusive dialogue among practitioners? What do you see the development and the innovation in financial markets in terms of pushing the dialogue forward?
Sure, thanks for that question. And I'm going to build on everything that my fellow panelists said, because it's so important in terms of conversely, I mean, using the just transition as an excuse to delay action, it's actually the opposite, in that it is an instant call to action or an urgent call to action, because we have to put the strategies in place today. So over the next 5 years of this decade, we need to be figuring out everything that my fellow panelists said in terms of our financing solutions in the low carbon transition, but how that's socially inclusive, how that creates socioeconomic value along the way, is going to be understanding the unintended consequences as we do finance and work towards that transition, and working out those unintended consequences in these next 5 years so that we can build on the solutions, mitigate the negative impacts, build on the solutions over the latter part of this decade and then beyond. And we don't really have time, or certainly from a banking perspective, and ensuring the well-being of the economic well-being of the communities where we operate, we don't have time to have that be sorted out in the later part of the decade. So in terms of BMO's actions, launching the commitment to the $300 billion in sustainable finance to our fiscal 25. So over the first 5 years of this decade is very much about identifying those solutions, launching the products, understanding which products can take us where, and then developing new ones to accelerate that change. So for example, we have the $500 million sustainability linked bond. That's tied to UN Global Compact Sustainable Development Goal outcomes, as well the 250 million Impact Fund, which is also tied to environmental and social goals, and other products that are being launched as well and will continue to be launched. Kind of pulling that together, in this year, we launched a dedicated energy transition group, which is going to be leveraging all those tools that we are developing across the bank. So it's pairing our core products and services with the more innovative solutions and financing tools that we're developing now, so that we can advance our clients' energy transition objectives. So understanding the technologies, enabling those technologies, and where can we pull from impact funds and socially themed investments and finance and loan products, so that we can enable some of those energy solutions to support communities where the potential for negative economic impacts are highest. And so monitoring all of that, developing all of that, and tracking the progress so that we can build and accelerate moving forward in the next part of this decade and beyond.
Well, identifying the areas of impact, as you mentioned, and looking at communities is something that we need to deeply unpack and look into. I want to, before moving on to the next question, just to pick on what you mentioned there, Susan, in terms of looking holistically at the impact and looking at how we are deploying the funds that are needed in certain communities. So just to understand there, when you look at impact and you measure your engagement, how is your stakeholder engagement looking like as a financial institution in terms of bringing everybody around the table and identifying priority areas where we need to transition and put the money at?
Sure. So another initiative, which is very close to what I do, we launched the BMO Climate Institute, and that is leveraging or convening all of the science expertise, the policy expertise, technology, and economics, so that we can convene those partnerships. So, for example, where we can identify some opportunities to advance climate solutions, but there could be some negative social impacts that need to be addressed, or maybe, kind of convening different perspectives so that we can advance the solutions. So working with policy where there's policy impediments, and understanding where the potential social impact is not going to be enabling some of the advancement of the energy technologies. So definitely convening the different partnerships. So how can we support financing solutions and in new innovative partnerships to bring new types of finance to the solutions, to enable equity opportunities for communities that have been previously potentially excluded from the development of some of the industries. So as Mark was talking about, there are parts of the green economy where there are communities that have not previously played in those spaces, and so how can we make sure that the development of those industries have meaningful economic inclusion for those communities, and convening those partnerships with the different areas of the community to make sure that those players have meaningful parts, and making sure that any policy impediments to moving some of this forward is something that we actively engage and advocate for in terms of our addressing the solution.
Well, good point there in terms of the solution and identifying and spending on that. But I think I'll take that back to you, Mark, and to you, Mijin, and please, Camilla and Susan, feel free to add to that. We have experience in the US and in Canada, and from your perspectives, in the transition from coal. Previous communities, there were some transition plans that are, let's just say, closer in time than previous transitions, but we have felt it, and we have maybe made some mistakes and have some good lessons that we can learn on. How can we accelerate the learning curve from that and make sure that we do not miss the beat on the energy transition and the broad economic sector's transition needed?
Just jump in. Can I jump in here?
Yes, please go ahead.
You're right. Some of the, not just coal, but any of the extractive industries in Indigenous communities, we are hosts to many abandoned mines. They've been played out. The money has been gone. The resources are gone. There had never been an attempt to include the Indigenous people in a plan about what was to come later. We were not part of that discussion. The term in Canada has come from away. The decisions came from away, right? So we were left with the results. So the transition has to include the voices of those communities directly in the planning, in the governance. We talked about ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment standards. It was interesting when we were doing our research and figuring out where the Indigenous element of that was, we were told by the major pension funds in Canada, it's actually backwards. It should be G, S, and E. Because governance is where all the decisions happen, and then everything flows from there. Communities are not involved in these decisions. We need to be, and we need to be able to say, look, this is how it's best done on the ground if you're going to do something. Indigenous communities are not against the transition to a green economy, and by most sense, we are not against development. We're in favor of just development, and that means our voices have to be included right from the beginning.
I agree with all of that, and we'll just also add that I think a really big lesson from coal communities is that regardless of whether we want it or not, a transition has happened. So what has happened though is that it is now an unjust transition because there hasn't been the support needed for these communities and these workers. But as we see, the market has decided that a transition has occurred. And so I think we are actually a little bit behind in being able to support other fossil extractive industries and other extractive regions because it takes about 10 to 20 years of consistent support to help transition an economy away from fossil fuel extraction and use. So we are already behind on supporting these other communities. And I think the big lesson from coal is that a transition is going to occur. And if we don't do anything, it will be unjust.
Well, to include everybody, I think, yes, I see your hand there, Camilla.
Yeah, perhaps to just to strengthen the point that Mark was making earlier, that from our point of view at the ILO, social dialogue is key. And social dialogue means government, workers, employers, and of course the just transition requires also the broader stakeholder engagements, and Indigenous people are key players there. But it has to be meaningful. I think sometimes it's used as a box ticking exercise. And I think the point that was raised earlier on the fact that you need engagement from the onset. It shouldn't be something that you set in motion and then just because it's the fancy thing to do right now and that's what's been checked, you bring in stakeholders. You really need to design an inclusive process from the start. So I just wanted to reiterate that point that was really important also from our point of view. Thanks.
Well, that's a good point, Camilla, and maybe I'll take it back to all of you on this one. I hear very good remarks in terms of the agreement from your side on the need for an inclusive debate across the board. But just also to include you, Susan, and I'd like to hear financial markets perspective. How can we measure this engagement? How can we look at frameworks for targets and measurements that will take us forward? What are some the key metrics that we need to look at for us to drive this forward? And of course, when we want financial flows to flow into something, we need some metrics. And as you say, what you cannot measure, you cannot build progress on. So where do we start with the measurement progress?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And definitely as we develop the low carbon energy kind of aligned transition strategy for our energy portfolios, we need to also be thinking about how does that impact socioeconomic well-being and develop metrics so that we can track the jobs lost and the jobs created. So there are going to be jobs created. And how do we monitor the jobs that are created against the jobs that are lost and make sure that our transition, our own energy transition ambitions align with where we want to get to in terms of developing healthy communities? And it'll sound very small, but there's opportunity in building each of these small initiatives. So our own carbon offsets, the ones that we purchased to offset our operational carbon footprint, they have to support, they have to be community based. So, and we pick those regions for those offsets where it can have the greatest financial impact on the community, where it's most needed. If we can have a healthy, robust offset market, and we're working to develop that, and there's still policy impediments there too, but if we can develop that out more, then and it's offsets, but it's other revenue generating opportunities like that we can support in terms of enabling communities to find other sources of revenue, as well as gradually decreasing their reliance on fossil fuel derived assets. So it's not that any of these industries are going to go away overnight, and it might be that none of them go away at all. They're going to shift, and we don't know precisely what that shift is going to entail. As Mark said, mining is going to be very important for the low carbon transition. So how are they going to shift? How are those that are going to be impacted by the shift enabled to have successful outcomes in terms of the revenue from their own products and services, enabling Canada and the US to develop more value from those products and services? We do pull a lot of resources out of the ground and then we export them for value add opportunities elsewhere. There's some opportunity to develop more industry here and able to support the resource development as well as a value add product at the end of it. And then how do we monitor I mean, BMO, our whole future is based on thriving economically, the thriving of communities. So that includes economic well-being. And so making sure that we're monitoring the impact of the low carbon transition and our energy transition on the different communities and enabling industries that support them. And when we watch for technology solutions, and we can see that some of those technology solutions, the technology readiness is high, but the commercial readiness is still low. So those technology solutions that are high, they create new jobs for multiple different regions and industries, and they can be very fluid and virtual, especially through the pandemic, but even before. So there's not necessarily whole regions that are going to be at risk the same way. So how do we support the advancement of those technologies that are at a high readiness level, but low commercial readiness? And so they're still not bankable. We hear there's lots of capital around, but no projects, no projects. And really what they mean is there's no bankable projects. So what we need to be doing is identifying the policy barriers to enabling those technologies that will bring all of those green jobs. And we also have to identify those bankable, what's impeding from the finance sector, what's impeding the commercial readiness. And as I was talking about, we're launching these tools. Again, they sound like one-offs, but they're not. What they do is they create a bit of an innovative financing structure that we can leverage and build as we become more comfortable with it. And we can also use it to support our core financing capabilities so that we're able to advance the commercial readiness of these technologies and create new industries and shift existing industries with the technological advancement.
Well, I think shifting with technology advancements, identifying where they are, and I think these are very good points to jump on, and hearing the view of the panel in terms of, especially if we're building on previous experiences and we build on the need to move forward, extending sometimes the discussion in terms of extending the life support for some industries, or providing place-based support for certain industry, depending on the lobbying power. But if we are moving towards a more transparent future, how can we depoliticize that discussion, make sure that we are transitioning and not delaying a disorderly transition that would only probably, as seen through history, further negatively impact communities, not just directly, but other knock-off effects on communities, as you alluded to, Mark, that sometimes it is broader than just the economic project itself.
Maybe I could start by, I think actually we shouldn't depoliticize this system, because in fact what we have been maybe spent too much time looking at is the science and technology aspect of the climate crisis versus understanding that it's actually a political problem. Right? Maybe we could argue that we don't want to make it partisan, but it is a political problem. We need politicians, we need politics, we need policies. So I don't think that we should depoliticize it. In fact, I think we should emphasize more on how decisions are made and what decisions are made. You know, it's not just about the quantity of jobs, it's about the quality of jobs, right? When we're talking about a just transition, it's not just about where money is going, how much money is going, but where is it going, right? Is it flowing upwards or is it flowing outwards? You know, when the same, you know, that the panelists have mentioned, it's about meaningful engagement. These are all political processes and these are all political decisions. So in fact, I think we should embrace that this is now a very much a political problem that we should be thinking about and, you know, really leveraging from that perspective.
That is a very good point. And I see you there, Camilla. I would like to hear your thoughts on it as well, please.
Yeah, no, just to reiterate that I agree that perhaps depoliticizes is not exactly what we are talking about, but we need to create spaces where we can have constructive dialogue. And it's okay to have different perspectives, and there will be different stakeholders that have different needs and different priorities, but we need to create this safe spaces where you can discuss this thing, where you can negotiate it when necessary. And the second element I would suggest is evidence, because collecting evidence on the positive and negative impacts and what's happening on the ground and being transparent about that is what creates this kind of constructive and positive engagement, and that eventually will have reaching consensus.
And I'm going to jump in on a few seconds here. It's just to the financiers who are here. Indigenous people and communities need allies in those political discussions, and the strength of the financial institution in that discussion is invaluable. So be an ally to the communities.
Understood. I completely agree as well. And Mark, I have utmost respect for all the work that you've been doing. So I hope to continue the dialogue with you. And I would throw in depoliticize. I did mean as partisan. So agree with the finer point there. It is a political issue. It should not be partisan. And I think that stalled us. I think we can all agree that stalled us. So seeing it less and less be a partisan issue is incredibly important. The political aspect of it is as we develop these resources, and Mark, you mentioned natural gas as a transition fuel, the only way that will work is with strong political governance, and we need those resource revenues to be funneled back into transition solutions, and that has to be multi-stakeholder kind of agreement and convening through those that kind of governance of the revenues. So it can't be one party kind of, you know, sort of this is an economic opportunity for one party over another. It has to have strong political governance, and we've seen that in our work in other countries too, where we can use certain resources as transition opportunities to develop out economic solutions in new industries, but not if we don't have strong political governance over those resource revenues to have that play out that strategic plan.
But as we look at it strategically and also addressing to all of you, I think from each where you come from and where your expertise and your point of view, where do you think that we need to step up the dialogue? Where do we need evidence-based, as you mentioned? We said we need inclusive and we need a dialogue that fits to the purpose of our time. We need to transition, and we need to transition fast, and we need to be inclusive and just for everyone. So how do we look at this opportunity to make sure that we are building better, we are moving towards equitable future? So from you, where you are, where do you think we are behind, and the key actors that you would like to include in this discussion? And I'll start with you, Camilla, from a global policy perspective and what you have seen. Where can we start?
So I think it's key to align financial and investment flows and policy frameworks, both at the global level and at country level. And I think that's also what helps to build a durable type of impact when you have financing flowing into the country. And I think there, the long-term thinking of several investors is key, because sometimes that's what's missing with policymakers, and bringing them together at the same table can foster that long-term thinking that is really necessary to ensure the transition is just.
And Mijin, from your point of view, where do you think we need to take this this discussion, and where have we been behind in terms of elevating it to the need that we need it to be?
I would argue that environmental justice and climate justice and Indigenous organizations have been leading this fight for a long time. We just haven't been listening. And I think that one thing that we really have to tackle that I think is a much more difficult fight is the power of the fossil fuel industry. So when we think about, how do we need to engage, there's a very frank discussion that there has to be an almost elimination of that entire industry. And it is a very powerful and very wealthy industry. And I think we just can't get around the fact that that is the biggest hindrance. If we're honest, that is the biggest hindrance to climate action, is the fossil fuel industry. And so we have to build power amongst, grassroots organizations and other people to mobilize again, to push politicians to do the right thing. But we also have to decrease the power of the fossil fuel industry. We have to decrease their ability to make these decisions, to influence these decisions, because the reality is that it's an industry that has to be eliminated.
Well, that is a very strong lobbying power for the industry, for sure. And Mark, I'm going to take that to you from Mijin's point in terms of being a partner and in the transition, especially when it comes to certain oil regions in Canada and Indigenous people's participation. What is your uptake on that?
Well, to answer the first question first, how does this just transition happen? The biggest issue from Indigenous communities right now in trying to get involved in projects, because we often have the opportunity to participate now, but we have no capital. We have a lack of capital. We have a lot of land, but our lands are held in trust by the federal government, so we can't leverage them. We can't do anything with that, and we can't access capital, at least not reasonably priced capital. So for Indigenous people to be involved in the benefits of these projects, we need to have a seat at the table. And how do you have a seat at the table? You have an equity stake, or you have some way to access the revenues that are coming from those projects. This is not Indigenous people asking for free money. There are many situations in Canada right now where companies are well ahead of government, realizing they need Indigenous partners on the ground. They need to have the local community have a voice. They understand that because they're in our communities, but we can't participate. That's a policy issue, at least in Canada, where we do not have access to our own land, in many cases our own resources, because they're held in trust by the federal government. So in terms of the petroleum industry is, as said at the beginning, not going to go away overnight. There is a transition period that is going to happen. How the carbon is sequestered, how the shift happens, is going to result in a lot of disruption, and it's going to result in a lot of opportunities. So that's a technology question and a policy question. And what I said at the beginning, First Nations have been on the front end of all of this. So we need to have a say in that and possibly shift away from those things, but we need to have a say in that.
Well, from that, Mark, I'm going to take it to you, Susan, and I think I have a question from the audience as well that I'm going to address to you in that point and to others in the panel in terms of talking about this multi-stakeholder discussion. And as financial institutions and presenting the financial sector here, that engagement is something that is very important for everybody. So how also from your viewpoint, do you include and measure this this engagement and foster the various viewpoints at the decision table?
So measures still to come. I mean, we're still working all of our metrics out, but engagement is something that is completely ingrained in how we're going to move this forward. So I mentioned that we're going to need new partnerships, and Mark's absolutely right. I mean, who doesn't have an equity position now and should have an equity position, and how do we address that? And these are policy decisions, and policy needs private capital, and we still haven't what we want to improve, and so we'll find ways to track our progress and measure success. What we do want to improve, and this is on the side of the policymakers as well as BMO, is engaging with the policymakers to say this is what we can do to accelerate some of these solutions and bring in new groups as well in terms of some of those solutions. We're going to need new technologies. We're going to need different partners. And so how do we put those partners together? How do we work with governments to enable those partnerships to happen? And making sure this is when I talk about this building period, the first part, I guess we're into the first 5 years of this decade. And this is the building part where we are thinking about how do we shift some of our financing solutions within the core of what we do already. What can we build out with which partners? And they won't necessarily be all the same partners that we had in the past. And so exploring all of that and developing them, and it's taking time because it isn't just replicable the way that we've been doing business all along. I mean, this is an economic overhaul that we're talking about. So new ways of doing business, new partnerships, leveraging our existing partners. Our clients are transitioning, so we're working with our clients on that journey. And then what we want to be able to do, and we're in the process of developing this out over these next 5 years, is to have something built, understand where the successes are, and then advance or build on and replicate those successes in the second part of this decade.
Well, as we move to the next decade, I think we are very short on time here. And before I wrap up, I'm going to take it to you, Camilla. And in the short term that we have globally at a global policy and at an ILO level, what would you prioritize as you've seen engagement across countries? What do you say our next focus should be?
So I think the energy transition is it starts to get into full speed. So it's definitely a space to watch, and where a fast engagement on just transition is absolutely necessary. But I would think it's also important to start thinking about other sectors as well: food systems, agriculture in general, transport, and new types of cities. I think we need to start getting ready for all the transition that are going to happen across the economy and societies.
Well, a great point to end at, and I am very sad that the time has lapsed us. It was such a pleasure to have you on this panel. Thank you again for your insights, and we look forward to host you again to hear more about your thoughts. We look forward to this, and thank you, and have a great rest of the summit.
Merci. Thank you all. We had real relevant initiatives discussed here.